What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some impressions for New Arc Line, specifically just ahead of its early access release tomorrow, which is possible because Fulcrum Publishing, the publisher, reached out and asked if I wanted to take a look at the early access version after taking a look at a demo as part of Steam Next Fest back in October. Obviously, I love CRPGs, so I of course agreed, and here we are. And I'm happy to say that New Arc Line seems to have grown a little bit since its demo, which was already surprisingly solid. And while I would say this particular build is absolutely an early access version, and thus, unfinished, certainly prone to a few bugs, I think they're headed in the right direction. And to give you a little sample of that, in this version of the game, I encountered a giant automaton with saws for hands, who was quite insistent that it was tasked with performing some crime. I encountered a leprechaun acting as a loan shark, but of course handing out fake gold for laughs, and later still horribly mutated rats clogging up the city's sewer system. So there were a lot of fun quests in there, and what's more, the main quest seems to be fully voice acted, though the side areas of the game, so to speak, the side quests and whatnot, don't seem to be, so it looks like there will likely be partial voice acting for this, and things are looking pretty good. But before we get into all that, what actually is this game? What's it about if you haven't heard of it? New Arc Line is effectively a steampunk CRPG inspired by the likes of Arcanum. In fact, if you've played Arcanum, you'll kind of get the gist of a lot of this pretty quickly, but our character arrives in the city of New Arc under the pretense of smuggling some artifact in of clearly dubious nature, all while the city is undergoing some changes. In times very long past, mages and magic used to rule the land with near infinite power, only to eventually fall and the rise of technology to happen in their absence. And just like Arcanum, these two methodologies are in fact at odds with each other. These days, everyone is very suspicious of mages and anybody who can practice magic, and the larger the presence of one, the worse off the other is and becomes less effective. Which is especially important now in a technologically advanced city like New Arc Line, which happens to be dealing with something called the Iron Plague, which is a plague, obviously, that is affecting people and slowly destroying them by turning them into monsters, which unsurprisingly is predominantly happening among the poor of the city. But let's get into the rest of this. Now, if you watched my previous video and saw character creation, that remains largely unchanged, which means it is still somewhat unfinished. They are planning on adding extra playable races, as well as starting classes, so there will be some expansions here, but there is a pretty solid cosmetic character creation, especially for an indie CRPG, and that is coupled with a few choices. Right now, you can pick between human or elf, though it is my understanding that they have dwarves and giants planned as well that you'll be able to play as later. Class-wise, you can pick between diesel engineer or voodoo shaman, or magic and tech respectively. Again, these are just a starting point. Later on, you'll be able to pick between Tesla and Steam technology as well for the technology side, and then celestial and occult magic as well for the magic side. So all in all, in the final version, we should ultimately wind up with 6 different types here, which is probably worth knowing. Now, otherwise, character creation is still the same. You can allocate stat points. These are important, providing big bonuses to your character. You'll also be able to pick up traits. Traits are a positive for a negative generally that allow you to customize your character a bit farther. Now, as you start moving into the game proper, it's important to note that your class does seem to determine the availability of items for you. Some stuff is not class specific, but things like armor and weapons do appear to be specific to your class, which would make sense given the juxtaposition of magic versus technology that they're enforcing here. So that's worth knowing. And then as you level up, you can allocate points into your various skills, increasing either your overall ability with your chosen type of class, that is to say, how good you are with that class's stuff. For instance, Voodoo Shaman can increase their strength with voodoo magic, or a host of other skills that allow them to more easily pass skill checks. Skill checks come up a lot in this game, especially in dialogue, which will open up various options for quests to be completed. Just in this early access impressions and the newer area that I was able to explore, there were multiple quests with multiple different outcomes that I could influence by passing or failing these checks. To give one example, I was able to break up a hospital, supposedly, that actually turned out to be an underground boxing championship that the doctor there was pitting the sick patients against each other for cash for the wealthy's amusement, which was pretty messed up, and you can choose to either get as involved as you please or remain completely apathetic to the whole thing and walk away, which I thought so far they've done a pretty good job of. Now in the demo we got to meet the first companion, Mick, a giant who is a steampunk technology guy, but in this early access version we also get a new companion named Letta. This woman is really good with diesel technology specifically, and she gets some very powerful guns right away that make her very, very useful in combat. Which brings me to the other thing. Combat seems to be improved from the demo, but still has a long way to go, for sure. So a couple of notes right away. For starters, a lot of the early access bugs seem to be around combat and pathing particularly, so that's definitely something to keep in mind, but also, once you get your characters geared up and kind of moving and you get your first 3 party members here, combat gets a lot better than it was in the demo, where a regenerating armor mechanic made things kind of difficult, but now, with all these companions and the possibility of learning and adapting skills, which means you could set up and apply various status effects to enemies. But while it is overall better, a few things are still going to need some balancing. For starters, the stun mechanic is extremely overpowered. It's very easy to stun enemies as well as you yourself be stunned, which loses your next turn, and because you're often outnumbered, that can quickly be to your detriment if you're fighting anything with a group stun attack, which can feel a little random and down to whoever gets that first initiative roll as opposed to an actual challenge. So I think they've still got some balancing to do there, especially because guns in particular seem to be very, very strong. They can penetrate enemies, so they'll hit multiple targets, and they even have skills that will do even more of that on top of big AoE attacks. I got an explosive shot that hit every enemy in a small area, and guns were by far the best damage dealer, and I think that's exacerbated a little bit by the fact that magic actually comes with a secondary downside. Outside of having to find and learn your spells and everything, and that takes time to get up to speed, you actually also have to deal with magic corruption. As you use spells in combat, you take on more and more corruption, which is going to hurt you in the long run and will be something you have to mitigate and manage. And in comparison to just picking like something technology based and blasting everything away with guns, is gonna leave you worse off. So we'll have to see how that pans out and winds up being balanced, because it is a concern for me right now. All said though, the encounters themselves seem to be relatively interesting, so I think if they can balance that, combat will be in a pretty good place. But I mentioned learning skills, so how does that work? So the technology side of things seems to primarily get their skills and abilities from their weapons they're using, but also gadgets you can either craft or of course purchase and use, such as things like grenades as an example. Now magic on the other hand works a little bit differently. You'll have a couple of starter spells, yes, but if you want to learn more, you have to track down these tarot cards from tears in reality. Throughout the world you might find these black looking portals, and if you reach into them or interact with them in general, you'll get a bunch of these tarot cards that can then be used in your magic crafting. These are divided up into form, element, and modifier, which is going to allow you to customize certain spells. A really strong one I got right away was a group paralyze, which, as I mentioned, stun is very overpowered, so this was super useful. And once you know that spell, you can just use it in combat whenever. So it looks like that magic crafting system will also be like the primary way you acquire new spells, which seemed especially cool to me. Now, before I leave off this impressions video, the last thing I want to talk about is the technical side of things. So, as this will be an early access release tomorrow, I would not expect it to be like, perfectly good to go, because it really isn't. In particular, I had a lot of trouble with pathing in this one. Characters, even the one you are controlling, having trouble figuring out where to go. And in combat, this could actually lead to a soft lock or two where I had to reload because the character was just infinitely running and couldn't reach their destination, and there was clearly no check in place to resolve that in the background. So I do think this game is a bit in a rough place, as you would honestly expect from an early access title. But the reason I'm covering it is largely because I am impressed with the direction they're headed here. I think that if they actually manage to bring this thing across the finish line, this will actually be a really cool CRPG, and it has a lot of potential. But literally just this year, we saw another CRPG with a lot of potential in early access fail, which was Unforetold Witchstone. So, understand the risk that comes with buying this, which is why I will give the advice I always give, which is that I would only buy into early access here if you are truly committed to, playing this and trying to give some feedback to make it a better game. Otherwise, you're better off waiting until the release of the title, if it makes it there. Now that said, this is launching into early access at a fairly cheap price, only $20. Which does not seem bad for the game's roughly 10 hours of content and, of course, a bit of replayability to go with that. But as always, with basically any CRPG, I will continue to update you and check this out as it receives major updates, etc. So if you're looking forward to any of that, definitely subscribe and stick around, because if nothing else, I have my eye on this, as I'll definitely be reviewing the full version. But do let me know how you feel about this one down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.